Quick question before we start. When you signed your last contract, phone plan, car loan, apartment lease, did you actually read it? Or did you scroll to the bottom, click, I agree, and move on? Because this story is about one man who spent 18 years reading every single word of every single document he signed. And when disaster struck, he was the only one left standing. Tuesday morning, February 8th, 1983, Riverside, Iowa. The snow came down in lazy spirals past the second-floor window of Lancaster County Savings Bank, each flake catching the gray light before vanishing against the brick storefronts of Main Street. 4 businesses down there had gone dark in the past 18 months: the hardware store, the diner and implement dealer, a clothing shop. Their windows reflected nothing now except the overcast sky and the empty sidewalks where farmers used to gather on Saturday mornings to argue about corn prices and complain about Washington. Andrew Jackson sat at his wooden desk and stared at the list. 13 names typed alphabetically on bank letterhead, each one representing a family he'd known his whole life. The coffee in his mug had gone cold 2 hours ago, untouched, since 8 a.m. when he'd first read the board's decision. His hands wanted to shake, but he wouldn't let them. Not yet. Not until this was finished. The phone felt heavier than it should have. He picked up the receiver, checked the first name on the list, and dialed. 4 rings, a voice hoarse and wary in a way that told Andrew the man had been waiting for this call. Michael Davis, this is Andrew Jackson at Lancaster County Savings. I'm calling regarding your operating loan account, 8472219. 14 seconds of silence. Andrew counted them. The clock on the wall ticked through each one like a countdown to something neither of them could stop. You're calling it. The words came out flat, defeated, as if Michael Davis had spent the past month rehearsing this moment in his head until all the anger and fear had burned down to ash. Yes, sir. The bank is exercising its right under the acceleration clause. You have 90 days to how much? $43,800. A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Andrew heard it catch, heard the pause where a man calculated his entire financial life in the space of 2 seconds and came up empty. I don't have that. The bank can discuss payment options. The line went dead, dial tone humming in Andrew's ear like a flat accusation. He set the phone down and sat motionless for 30 seconds, watching the snow fall. Then he picked it up again and dialed the second name. Linda Wilson answered, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that comes from knowing bad news is on the way, but not yet knowing how bad. May I speak with John? What's this about? She already knew. The whole county knew. When a bank starts calling operating loans in the middle of winter, word spreads faster than a barn fire. Bank business, ma'am? A muffled sound, the phone changing hands, and then John Wilson's voice came through, steady but brittle. Andrew, I know why you're calling. John, I'm calling about your loan. We've never missed a payment, Andrew. Not one. 11 years. Every payment on time. The words came out strained, like he was trying to hold on to something solid while the ground shifted beneath him. I understand, but this isn't about missed payments. It's about collateral value. The land didn't change. The price changed. How is that my fault? Your contract allows acceleration based on market conditions. My contract says, for any reason. I finally read it last night after my neighbor called and said you'd be calling us too. In the background, Andrew could hear Linda Wilson crying. Not loud, just a quiet, steady sound that made something in his chest tighten. Tell David Taylor something. Tell him he's destroying families. Click. Dead air. Andrew sat with the receiver pressed to his ear for a few seconds longer than necessary before hanging up. His hands were shaking now. He let them. The third call went worse. Anthony Moore picked up on the first ring, his voice already sharp with anger. I know who you are, and I know why you're calling. The answer is I don't have $46,000. Nobody does. The bank. The bank loaned us money when land was $2,200 an acre and corn was $3. Now you're calling loans when land's $1,100 and corn's under $2. You people created this mess. Anthony. You know who won't get this call? Ryan Mitchell. Because he read his contract. He negotiated. Everyone said he was crazy. The line went quiet for a moment, just long enough for Andrew to hear Anthony Moore take a breath that sounded like he was drowning. Turns out crazy just means careful, and trusting means ruined. The phone slammed down so hard, Andrew flinched. He made 5 more calls before 10:30, each one a variation on the same theme. Shock, anger, desperation, the sound of families coming apart in real time. By the time he reached the 9th name on the list, his coffee was still cold and his hands had stopped shaking because there was nothing left to shake. Just the mechanical motion of dialing numbers and delivering bad news to people who'd done nothing wrong except trust a piece of paper they'd never read. Ryan Mitchell. There was a note clipped to the file folder written in David Taylor's precise handwriting. Call Mitchell too. Test if he knows his clause. Andrew stared at the note for a long moment. Ryan's loan had been paid off in 1980. There was no debt to call. But the bank president had been explicit. Make the call anyway. See if the legend was true. See if Ryan Mitchell really knew every word of his contract the way people said. He dialed. 1 ring. The phone picked up immediately. Andrew. The voice on the other end was calm, almost conversational, as if Ryan Mitchell had been sitting by the phone waiting for this exact call at this exact moment. Mr. Mitchell, this is I know who you are, and I know why you're calling. You've made 8 calls already this morning. I'm number 9. Andrew's throat went dry. How does he know, sir? Before you continue, I need you to do something. I need you to read me the acceleration clause from my contract. Page 6, Section 4, Paragraph 2. Read it to me, word for word. Mr. Mitchell, I don't have your specific document in front of. I do. I'm looking at it right now. It's been highlighted in yellow since May 1965. Faded, but still visible. There was a rustling sound, paper being handled, and then Ryan Mitchell's voice came back on the line, clear and precise. My clause reads, lender may demand full payment of outstanding balance only upon written notice of a borrower default on scheduled payment exceeding 30 days from due date, or B. borrower's intentional physical damage to pledged collateral as verified by lender inspection. He paused, letting the words settle. 2 triggers, Andrew. Payment default or intentional damage, not market conditions, not board policy, not portfolio management, not any reason. Andrew's fingers found the file folder and flipped it open, scanning for the loan documents. Have I defaulted on any payment in the past 18 years? No, sir. Your payments wait. Your loan's paid off. Exactly. So under what authority is the bank calling my loan? The silence stretched between them. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Andrew Jackson realized he'd just been given a lesson in contract law by a farmer with a highlighted document and 18 years of preparation. "I'd like to meet with David Taylor Friday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. Tell him to bring my original 1965 contract with Mark Thompson's signature. I'll bring my copy. We'll lay them side by side and compare." "Mr. Mitchell, I'm not sure that's 10 a.m. Friday." "I'll be there." "One more thing, Andrew." "Yes, when you finish calling those 13 farmers today, ask yourself this: how many of them actually read their contracts before they signed? How many knew what page 6 said?" The line clicked off. Andrew sat frozen for 3 minutes, the receiver still in his hand, staring at Ryan Mitchell's file. Highlighted in yellow at the top of the page was a note from Mark Thompson dated 1965. Modified clause. Knows every word. Do not attempt to call this loan. He set the phone down carefully and wrote in the margin, "Called anyway." He was ready. But here's what nobody at Lancaster County Savings understood. Ryan Mitchell didn't read contracts because he was paranoid or difficult. He read them because 26 years earlier, in a farmhouse kitchen in Riverside, Iowa, he watched his father's world collapse. Not from drought, not from bad farming, from 3 words on page 7 of a contract his father signed without reading. 3 words that cost them 120 acres of prime Iowa ground. July 1955. Kenneth Mitchell had walked into Riverside Community Bank needing $8,000 for seed fertilizer and a used grain drill, the kind of loan every farmer in Lancaster County took out every spring, as routine as planting corn. Robert Allen, the banker, had been Kenneth's friend since grade school. They'd played football together, coached Little League together, sat in the same pew at church every Sunday. When Robert slid the 9-page contract across his desk, Kenneth signed on page 9 without reading page 7, because that's what friends did. They trusted each other. The interest rate was 6%, fair. The loan term was standard. The collateral was Kenneth's 280 acres of good Iowa farmland, productive and well-maintained. Kenneth shook Robert's hand, took his copy of the contract, and went home to plant his crops. The whole transaction took 25 minutes. What Kenneth didn't see, buried in Section 8 on page 7, was a clause that read, "Lender may accelerate and demand immediate payment of full outstanding principal balance, accrued interest, and all associated fees upon 30 days written notice for any reason lender deems necessary or prudent to protect lender's financial position, portfolio quality, or institutional interests." For any reason. Those 3 words sat there in the contract like landmines waiting. 2 years passed. Kenneth made every payment on time. The crops came in good. The equipment ran fine. Robert Allen cashed the checks and smiled at church on Sundays. Everything was fine. Spring 1957, Des Moines Agricultural Trust bought Riverside Community Bank as part of a regional consolidation wave sweeping through Iowa. The new management came from the city MBA-trained executives who looked at farm loans as data points in a portfolio rather than relationships with neighbors. They reviewed Kenneth's loan and flagged it immediately. $8,000 at 6% interest when the prime rate had climbed to 7.5, underperforming asset. Eliminate it. May 1st, a letter arrived. Kenneth signed for it, opened it at the kitchen table while Nancy poured his coffee. Pursuant to page 4 to section 2, your interest rate will adjust to 9.75% effective June 1st. The payment jumped from $480 a year to $780. A $300 increase overnight. 62.5%. Kenneth stared at the number until it stopped making sense, then stared at it some more. He scraped together $195 from savings and made the first payment at the new rate, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. "It's temporary," he told Nancy. "Rates will drop." They didn't. June 18th, another letter. Farmland values across Iowa had softened 9 to 12%, not a crash, just a normal market fluctuation. Kenneth's loan-to-value ratio had been 61% when he signed conservative and safe. After the dip, it calculated to 68.4%, still solid by any reasonable standard. But Des Moines Trust used their own appraiser who valued land 20% below market comparables, and suddenly Kenneth's LTV was 76.8%. Pledge additional 45 acres unencumbered or pay $3,600 cash to reduce principal and restore LTV to 70%. Kenneth didn't have 45 unencumbered acres. All 280 were already pledged. He didn't have $3,600 in cash, with harvest 11 weeks away and no way to get it. July 8th, the third letter arrived. Certified mail. Kenneth signed for it, his hand steady, because he didn't yet understand what he was holding. Pursuant to page 7, section 8, paragraph 3, Des Moines Agricultural Trust hereby exercises its contractual right to accelerate full loan balance. Total amount due $7,840. Payment deadline August 10th. 33 days. Kenneth read it 3 times before the words connected to their meaning. Then he got in his truck and drove to the bank. Robert Allen was still there, kept on as branch manager under the new ownership. He sat behind the same desk where he'd shaken Kenneth's hand 2 years earlier, but something in his posture had changed. His shoulders carried the weight of decisions that weren't his to make anymore. Kenneth's hands shook as he set the letter on the desk between them. "Robert, what is this? I've never missed a payment." Robert wouldn't meet his eyes. "I know, Ken, but I don't make these decisions anymore. Des Moines calls the shots now, but I pay on time. Every quarter. Never late. This isn't about late payments. It's about policy, portfolio management." Kenneth's voice rose despite his effort to control it. "What gives them the right?" Robert slid the contract across the desk. Kenneth's signature visible on page 9, like an accusation. Section 8, right there. His finger pointed to page 7, to the clause Kenneth had never read. "For any reason lender deems necessary." Kenneth stared at the words as if they were written in a language he didn't speak. "For any reason you signed it, Ken. July 1955. Page 9. That's your signature." The words came out like an apology. Robert couldn't quite bring himself to make. "I didn't read it. You're my friend. We coach Little League together." Robert finally looked up, his eyes red in a way that had nothing to do with allergies. "I know, and I'm sorry. But friendship doesn't change what's in the contract, and the contract is what matters." Kenneth tried 5 banks. All refused. Distressed borrower red flag in the system. He tried borrowing from neighbors, but nobody had $7,800 in cash lying around in July. He tried to sell crop futures, but there were no buyers with harvest still uncertain. The only option left was land sold fast at whatever price desperation would bring. James Hill, the neighboring farmer, saw an opportunity. Fair market value for 120 acres would have been around $19,000 even after the recent dip. Hill offered $12,840, 55 cents on the dollar. Take it or lose everything. Kenneth took it. The closing happened July 29th, after the bank took their $7,840, after the attorney took $380, after the surveyor took $215, after the title company took $185, after recording fees took $97. Kenneth walked away with $4,123 and 160 acres of the rockiest, hilliest ground on the original farm. The good land, flat, fertile with creek access and excellent drainage, belonged to James Hill now. What Kenneth lost couldn't be measured just in acres or dollars. He lost something in his face that never came back. The way his shoulders sat, the way he moved through a room like he was apologizing for taking up space. Nancy watched her husband age 8 years in 6 weeks, watched him stop going to church because he couldn't face Robert. Alan watched him quit the Rotary Club, watched him start having a drink after dinner when he'd never been a drinking man. And 16-year-old Ryan Mitchell watched all of it from the hallway. July 30th evening. Ryan came home from his summer job working a neighbor's hay crew and found his parents at the kitchen table, his father's head in his hands, his mother crying in that quiet way people cry when they've run out of loud. Ryan froze in the doorway, one hand still on the frame. It's gone. 120 acres. The good land, the flat ground with the creek. Kenneth's voice was muffled by his palms, but Ryan heard every word. But you never missed a payment. Doesn't matter. The contract says, for any reason. I signed page 9. Didn't read page 7. Robert is your friend. Robert doesn't work for me. He works for Des Moines now. And Des Moines wants their money. Kenneth looked up, then his face wet and red in a way Ryan had never seen. I trusted him. I trusted the handshake, and I lost 120 acres. Ryan backed away from the doorway before they could see him, went to his room, and sat on the edge of his bed until the house went quiet. 11:34 p.m. by the clock on his nightstand. He walked back to the kitchen. The contract was still on the table where Kenneth had left it, too painful to file away, too important to throw out. Ryan sat down and started reading. Page 1 was borrower information. Boring. Page 2 was loan amount and purpose. Straightforward. Page 3 was the payment schedule. Simple enough. Page 4 had the interest rate clause, and Ryan read it 3 times. Lender reserves right to adjust before moving on. Page 6 had the collateral demand clause, and he saw the trap immediately. Page 7 had the acceleration clause. For any reason lender deems necessary or prudent. He read it again and again and again, 7 times total, as if repetition would somehow change the words or reveal a loophole that wasn't there. At 12:09 a.m., Ryan pulled his notebook from his school bag and wrote in careful block letters, July 31st, 1957, 12:09 a.m., Dad lost 120 acres today because he signed page 9 without reading page 7. 3 words buried in section 8 for any reason. Those 3 words gave the bank unlimited power, and Dad gave them that power without knowing it because he trusted instead of read. I will never make that mistake. I will read every contract I ever sign, every page, every section, every word. I don't care if it takes hours. I don't care if people think I'm crazy. I will never sign what I don't understand. Never give anyone power over what I own without knowing exactly what I'm agreeing to. This is my oath to myself, to Dad, even though he doesn't know I'm making it. They can call me paranoid. They can call me difficult. I don't care. I'd rather be paranoid with land than trusting without it. Ryan Mitchell. Morning came too early. Ryan was still at the table when Kenneth walked into the kitchen at 6:47, stopping short when he saw his son sitting there with the contract open. "You read it. All 9 pages. Took me 2 hours." Kenneth sat down heavily, the chair creaking under his weight. "Then you know what I did wrong. You trusted Robert Allen. I did. He was my friend. I thought that mattered. Does it?" Kenneth looked at the contract for a long moment before answering. "No. What matters is what's written here. On page 7. He reached across the table and put his hand over Ryan's. "Listen to me. This is the only advice I'll ever give you about this. Don't trust what a man says the contract means. Read the paper yourself. Every word. I will. Promise me. I promise." Kenneth farmed the remaining 160 acres until 1963, when his health finally broke under the accumulated weight of stress and shame. He retired at 58, looking 70, handed Ryan the deed, and apologized for only giving him 160 when it should have been 280. A year later, massive coronary, dead at 59. Robert Allen came to the funeral but stood in the back and left before the burial. But that night in 1957, after making his promise to his father, Ryan Mitchell began an education that would consume the next 8 years of his life. He read every law book in Lancaster County Library. He memorized legal terms until the librarian started setting aside new acquisitions for him. He graduated high school valedictorian with a 3.94 GPA, driven by the memory of his father crying at a kitchen table over 3 words on page 7. Summer 1960, he found his mentor. Jonathan Bradford had practiced law in Lancaster County for 42 years before retiring in 1958. Farm law, estate planning, contract disputes. His wife Shirley had died of cancer in 1959, leaving him alone in a house full of law books and empty rooms. When 19-year-old Ryan Mitchell showed up at his door on a Saturday afternoon and asked if he'd teach him contract law, Jonathan's first response was suspicion. "Why does a farm boy want to learn legal contracts?" Ryan told him about page 7, about 3 words, about 120 acres, sold at 55 cents on the dollar because his father had trusted a handshake more than he'd trusted his own eyes. Jonathan was quiet for a long time after Ryan finished talking. "Your father learned what every attorney knows, and most people never do. The law protects people who read, not people who trust." Every Saturday for 3 years, 2 to 5 p.m., Ryan sat in Jonathan's study, surrounded by leather-bound books that smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco. He learned the vocabulary acceleration consideration breach, remedy, default covenant, unconscionability, estoppel force majeure. He learned the philosophy. Every contract is written by someone with an advantage. Usually the person with lawyers, and your job is to find where they hid that advantage. Jonathan's key lesson repeated so often it became a rhythm. Standard form means standard for them. Everything is negotiable. Most people just don't know that. Ryan's first real-world application came in 1960 when Kenneth asked him to handle the farm's crop insurance renewal. Kenneth couldn't look at contracts anymore. The sight of fine print made his hands shake. Donald Thomas, the Farm Bureau agent, expected it to go like every other renewal. Sign page 7, pay the premium, done. Just sign page 7, Kenneth. Same policy as always. Ryan pulled out his dictionary. I'll read it first. It's standard. Same as last year. Then I'll read it quickly. 1 hour and 42 minutes later, Ryan found what he was looking for on page 5. Coverage does not apply to losses resulting from acts of God, unseasonable weather conditions, atmospheric phenomena, or natural events beyond human control or prediction. Define unseasonable weather conditions. Donald shifted in his chair. Weather that's unusual for the season? In Iowa, all our weather is unusual. We had 90 degrees in April last year. Was that unseasonable? If my corn burns up from April, heat is that excluded? Well, the company would evaluate each claim based on what standard. This language is so broad you could deny any weather-related claim and call it unseasonable. The negotiation took another 37 minutes and a phone call to the regional office before Donald agreed to replace the vague language with specific exclusions, tornado F3 or higher flood exceeding the 100-year event level. Nothing else. Total time 2 hours, 19 minutes for a 7-page document. Within 10 days, the story had spread through Lancaster County like drift from a sprayer. Kenneth Mitchell's kid arguing with insurance agents, 19 years old and reading policies with a legal dictionary. What's wrong with him? But Ryan didn't care what people said. He cared about what was written. And over the next 5 years, while Kenneth's health slowly collapsed and the farm passed into Ryan's hands, he built a reputation one contract at a time. Difficult, obsessive, someone who didn't trust anyone. He met Amy Walker at a church social in 1962. She was 20, taught 3rd grade, had the kind of practical patience that came from managing classrooms of 8-year-olds. She noticed Ryan reading the church bulletin's fine print, and instead of finding it strange, she found it interesting. Most boys talked about crops and weather. Ryan talked about acceleration clauses. Their 3rd date, he showed her Kenneth's contract, pointed to page 7, explained how 3 words had cost his family 120 acres. So you read everything to make sure you know what you're risking, not paranoia, protection. She understood then, understood that this wasn't about trust issues or suspicion. This was about a 16-year-old boy watching his father break and deciding that knowledge was the only defense against the world's appetite for taking what you owned. They married in June 1964. At the courthouse, Ryan read the marriage license for 18 minutes while the clerk tapped her pen against the desk and Amy's bridesmaids exchanged glances. But Amy just smiled because she knew why. She knew he'd never sign away their future without understanding every word of what he was agreeing to. Spring, 1965. Ryan walked into Lancaster County Savings Bank needing $6,000 for seed fertilizer and operating capital. Mark Thompson, the loan officer, had closed hundreds of farm loans in his 19-year career. Most took 30 minutes. Sign on the lines with the tabs, shake hands, done. Ryan arrived at 9 a.m. carrying a brown leather briefcase that had belonged to his father. Inside, Jonathan Bradford's contract law notes a template of what a fair acceleration clause should look like. 17 questions about standard loan terms, Kenneth's 1955 contract, Webster's dictionary, a legal pad, and 3 pens. Mark slid the 11-page contract across the desk at 9:04. Just need your signature on pages 3, 7, and 11. Ryan opened his briefcase. Before I sign, I'll need to read the contract. Of course. Take your time. Mark expected 10, maybe 15 minutes. At 9:35, Ryan was still on page 3 making notes in his legal pad, checking definitions in his dictionary. At 9:53, he stopped at page 4 and pulled out his red pen. Page 4, interest rate clause. It says, adjusted quarterly at lender's discretion. Standard variable rate provision. Does it adjust up only, or does it go down? When prime drops, it moves with prime. If prime goes down, your rate goes down. Can you show me where the contract says that? Mark reread the clause? The word down appeared nowhere. Well, it's implied. Implied isn't written. My father's loan had a rate clause that said, adjusted at lender discretion. They raised it 62% overnight and never lowered it, because the contract didn't require them to lower it. What do you propose? Fixed rate, 8.25%, full loan term, no adjustments. Mark had to call David Taylor, the bank president, who reviewed Ryan's file and saw what Mark had missed. This was Kenneth Mitchell's son, the farmer who'd lost land in 1957 to an acceleration clause, the kid who'd been reading contracts with a dictionary since he was 19. David came down to the conference room at 10:12 and found Ryan waiting with documents organized in neat stacks and a demeanor that suggested he'd wait all day if necessary. Mr. Mitchell, Mark says you want fixed rate. Yes, sir. 8.25% locked renewable annually on same terms. You understand that's highly unusual for a farm operating loan. I understand. It protects me from what happened to my father in 1957. The room went quiet. David Taylor had heard the story. Everyone in banking had heard some version of it. The cautionary tale about what happens when acquisition teams from the city start calling loans based on portfolio theory instead of relationships. Your father was Kenneth Mitchell. Yes, sir. Riverside Community Bank, 1957. They raised his rate from 6 to 9.75. Then called the loan. Page 7. For any reason. He lost 120 acres. I heard about that. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just agree to fixed rate so it doesn't happen to me. David Taylor's uncle had lost a hardware store in 1948 to a similar clause. Different bank, different town, same mechanism. A contract that gave the lender unlimited power and a borrower who'd trusted the handshake. He'd watched his uncle spend the rest of his life, bitter and diminished, and somewhere in the back of his mind he'd promised himself that if he ever had the power to prevent that from happening to someone else, he would. Fixed 8.25. 1-year term renewable annually at same rate if payments are current. Agreed, did. But the real test came at 10:26 when Ryan reached page 7. He stopped reading, went very still, pulled out Kenneth's 1955 contract, and laid the two documents side by side. This clause must be changed. Mark Thompson was an hour behind schedule and running out of patience. Mr. Mitchell, that's standard. Ryan cut him off with a look. I know it's standard. My father had the identical standard clause, and it cost him 120 acres. He slid Kenneth's contract across the desk, opened to page 7. Read Section 8, Paragraph 3 of my father's contract. Then read Section 6 of this contract. Same language, word for word. David read both. The language was indeed identical right down to the punctuation. This gives you unlimited power. Good crop, bad crop. Your coffee was cold that morning. You can call my loan for anything. We wouldn't abuse Riverside Community Bank, told my father. They wouldn't abuse it either. Then Des Moines Trust bought them. New management, new priorities, same clause. They used it. Ryan removed a typed page from his briefcase, prepared beforehand, anticipated this exact moment. I propose this language instead. Lender may accelerate full outstanding balance only upon written notice of a borrower default on scheduled payment exceeding 30 days from due date, or B, borrower's intentional physical destruction of or material damage to pledged collateral as verified by lender inspection. 2 triggers: payment default or intentional damage, nothing else, not market conditions, not portfolio management, not bank policy, not any reason. The negotiation stretched through lunch. David Taylor tried arguing for a collateral value provision. Ryan refused. Mark Thompson pointed out that this was in every farm loan they issued. Ryan said that was exactly the problem. Back and forth, clause by clause, until David finally made his offer. If I agree to restrict acceleration to default and damage only, I need something in return. Minimum operating account balance, $500. Ryan calculated silently. 500 at 0% interest is $500 of my money you use free. Counter proposal. Minimum balance, $200. Balance above $200 earns interest at 1% annually, paid quarterly. You've thought about this for 8 years, since I was 16, since I read my father's contract the night we lost the land. The loan committee voted 2-1 to approve the modified clause. Mark Thompson spent 47 minutes retyping the contract. Ryan read the rewrite word by word for 32 minutes, found a cross-reference error on page 9, waited while Mark corrected it, then read it again for another 8 minutes. He signed at 1:47 p.m. Total time in the bank, 4 hours and 47 minutes. That evening, Mark Thompson went home and told his wife about the farmer who'd spent almost 5 hours on a $6,000 loan. By the next morning, he'd told the story at the diner. By the end of the week, everyone in Lancaster County knew Ryan Mitchell reads contracts. The reputation formed fast, difficult, obsessive, doesn't trust banks, acts like everyone's trying to cheat him. Timothy Harris, who owned the John Deere dealership, had the line that got repeated the most: that Mitchell kid is going to make himself very unpopular very fast. Nobody wants to do business with someone who questions every detail and argues about every clause. The irony was perfect, though nobody could see it yet. In 18 years, when the farm crisis came and the bank started calling loans, Timothy Harris would be one of the ones who needed Ryan's help. But that was still years away, invisible on the horizon, like a storm that hadn't formed yet. For now, in 1965, Ryan Mitchell was just the paranoid kid with the briefcase and the dictionary and the unhealthy obsession with fine print. The one who'd rather spend 4 hours reading a contract than 30 minutes trusting a handshake. The one who remembered what 3 words on page 7 had cost his father. The one who'd promised himself in a notebook at 12:09 a.m. on a July night in 1957 that he would never sign what he didn't understand. Never give anyone power over what he owned without knowing exactly what he was agreeing to. The one who kept that promise. And when the phone rang 18 years later on a Tuesday morning in February 1983, when Andrew Jackson called to test whether the legend was true, Ryan Mitchell was ready. Because he'd been ready since he was 16 years old. Since the night he sat in a kitchen and watched his father cry over a piece of paper neither of them had read until it was too late. The years that followed built Ryan Mitchell's reputation one contract at a time, each negotiation adding another layer to the legend people told about him at diners and feed stores across Lancaster County. By 1966, businesses had learned to schedule him last, not as punishment, but as survival. Once Ryan walked into your office with his briefcase and dictionary, your evening plans disappeared. Mark Thompson started telling new employees the same thing every time. When Mitchell shows up, clear your calendar. You won't leave on time. Spring 1971, Lancaster County Co-op seed corn purchase. 80 acres worth of Pioneer Hybrid, the drought-resistant variety every farmer wanted after the dry spell in '69. Brian Young handled the sale, a straightforward transaction that should have taken 40 minutes. Ryan showed up at 2 p.m. with his briefcase. 3 hours later, they were still in Brian's office. The contract spread across the desk like evidence at a crime scene. Ryan had his red pen out, circling clause after clause, while Brian made phone calls to the regional office, trying to get approval for changes that no farmer had ever requested before. The problem sat on page 5, buried in the delivery terms. Seller reserves right to substitute comparable seed varieties without prior notification to buyer based on inventory availability or supply constraints. Define comparable. Brian shifted in his chair, already tired from 2 hours of this. Generally similar characteristics. That's not a definition. You could substitute 110-day corn for my 100-day corn and call it comparable because they're both corn. We'd never do something that unreasonable. Your contract says you can. The word is may, not should or might. You have the legal right. Remove the clause or define comparable. Merable with specific metrics. The phone call to the regional manager lasted 38 minutes. Ryan sat quietly during the hold music, reading other sections of the contract, making notes. When Brian finally hung up, his shirt was wrinkled and there were coffee rings on his desk blotter from cups he'd forgotten to drink. They agreed to change it. Define comparable as same brand, same maturity rating, plus or minus 5 days, same or better yield rating per company specifications. Total time 2 hours and 12 minutes. Summer 1972. The payoff arrived, wrapped in a drought that burned across Iowa like a slow fire. Pioneer 3.36.9, the drought-resistant variety, ran short nationwide. The co-op tried to substitute 3189 to other farmers, cheaper, less drought-resistant, but same maturity window. So technically, the contract language about comparable could be stretched to fit. Those farmers had signed without reading page 5. They accepted the substitution because the delivery truck showed up and they needed seed. And what were they going to do? Argue with a truck driver about contract law? Ryan's contract required same or better yield rating per company specs. Pioneer's own documentation rated 3189, lower than 3369 for drought conditions. The co-op had to honor his original order. Come harvest, Ryan pulled 71 bushels per acre, while his neighbors with the substituted seed averaged 52. At $2.40 a bushel, that extra 19 bushels per acre across 80 acres meant an additional $3,648 in his pocket. The cost of reading that contract for 2 hours and 12 minutes. Nothing. The cost of not reading it. Ask his neighbors. Word got around. Michael Davis heard about it at the grain elevator and told John Wilson, who mentioned it to Anthony Moore, who brought it up at the feed store where Timothy Harris was buying fence staples. Mitchell got the good seed. How I read the contract. You didn't. The response became Ryan's standard answer whenever someone asked how he'd managed to avoid whatever trap the rest of them had fallen into. Short, factual, impossible to argue with. Fall 1973. Timothy Harris's equipment dealership, 6-row corn planter lease. The deal looked clean on the surface, $4,800 annually, 3-year term standard, John Deere equipment that every farmer in the county used. Timothy expected Ryan to spend maybe an hour on it, maybe 2 if he was being particularly thorough. 4 hours later, they were still negotiating Clause 17. Lessee assumes full financial responsibility for all maintenance costs, repair expenses, depreciation charges, wear and tear assessments, and residual value adjustments during lease period. Ryan had his calculator out running numbers on a legal pad. I'm paying depreciation on equipment I don't own. And what's a residual value adjustment? Timothy leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd explained this 100 times. If the equipment depreciates faster than projected, there's an adjustment at lease end. So I pay the lease price plus extra if equipment value drops more than you predicted. I'm insuring your asset against your bad projections. It's industry standard, Ryan. Every equipment lease. Show me the John Deere corporate standard in writing. Timothy couldn't produce it. The regional rep couldn't produce it when Timothy called. What they could produce was authorization to remove the depreciation and residual clauses for this one customer because they needed the lease revenue, and Ryan Mitchell was the kind of person who'd walk away over a principle. You're my most difficult customer. Timothy meant it as a complaint, but Ryan heard it as confirmation that he was doing something right. I'm your most informed customer. If I'm difficult, it's because your contracts are one-sided. Spring 1974. Farm Bureau Insurance Multi-Peril Crop Coverage. Jacob Walker handled the policy, 8 pages of standard agricultural insurance language that most farmers signed while standing at his desk. Ryan sat down and pulled out his dictionary. 90 minutes later, Jacob was on the phone with his regional manager trying to explain why a farmer was demanding definitions for terms like acts of God and force majeure. Define every term: acts of God, force majeure, unseasonable weather, climatic anomalies, natural phenomena, reasonable human prediction. Jacob's frustration leaked through his professional demeanor. These are standard insurance terms, standard vague terms. Last year we had 89 degrees on March 23rd. Unseasonable. We had wind gusts to 47 miles per hour on July 8th. Natural phenomenon. We had no rain, June 4th through June 29th. Climatic anomaly. If any of those events damage my crop, are they excluded? The company would evaluate each claim based on how much they want to avoid paying. No. Either list specific exclusions with measurable thresholds or remove the vague language entirely. The regional manager authorized the change after a 53-minute phone call. Specific exclusions: only tornado rated EF2 or higher, flood exceeding FEMA 100-year event level hail exceeding 1.5 inches diameter. Everything else covered. Ryan's insurance premium stayed the same. His coverage became worth what he was paying for. Fall 1975, Des Moines grain elevator delivery contract for 5,200 bushels at $2.52 per bushel. The price looked locked, guaranteed safe. Ryan read page 3 and found the escape clause. Stated price guaranteed only if delivery occurs between October 1st and October 25th. Deliveries after October the 25th. Subject to prevailing spot market price at elevator manager's determination. What if weather delays harvest past October 25th? The manager's smile had the practiced quality of someone who'd heard this question before and had an answer ready. Then we renegotiate based on current market. So this isn't a price lock. It's a price lock with your escape clause. You get my corn either way, but you only pay the locked price if it's convenient for you. Mr. Mitchell, farmers accept these terms. Every farmers who don't read page 3 accept these terms. I read page 3. Extend delivery window through November 20th at locked price, or I haul to Iowa City elevator. Iowa City was 47 miles away. The fuel cost would eat into profit, but the manager knew Ryan would actually do it. Knew it from the way he sat there, calm and patient, with that contract open to page 3. Not bluffing, not posturing, just stating his terms and waiting. November 10th, final offer. November 15th, November 12th, and that's my absolute limit. Agreed. Same year, North Iowa Grain Cooperative membership. The application looked routine until Ryan reached the dispute resolution clause on page 9. All disputes between member and cooperative shall be resolved exclusively through binding arbitration. Arbitrator shall be selected by cooperative board of directors from cooperative's pre-approved arbitrator list maintained by board. Gary Robinson. The co-op manager had processed 200 membership applications in his career. Nobody had ever questioned the arbitration clause. You choose the arbitrator from your list. That's not neutral arbitration. That's a rigged system. It's standard in every co-op in the region. Then every co-op in the region has a structural conflict of interest. Neutral arbitrator from American Arbitration Association, or I sell grain elsewhere. The board won't approve that. Then I join a different co-op, or sell to Cargill directly. Gary made the call to regional. Ryan's annual volume was 5,200 bushels, projected to grow to 7,000 if he expanded. The math was simple: lose the principal or lose the revenue. They changed it. By 1975, the pattern was established across Lancaster County. When Ryan Mitchell walked into your office, you cleared your afternoon, prepared to defend every clause in your standard contract, and accepted that what you thought was standard was only standard until someone actually read it. The diner conversations followed the same script every time, minor variations on a theme of complaint and confusion. Ryan Mitchell spent 4 hours on a seed contract. Who does that? Someone with trust issues. He made me define acts of God in an insurance policy. Wanted measurable thresholds. It's crazy. Paranoid. Thinks everyone's trying to cheat him. Timothy Harris had the line that got repeated most often, delivered one Saturday morning at the feed store with perfect timing and an audience of 7 farmers who all laughed because they recognized the truth in it, even if they didn't understand the implications. Ryan Mitchell reads contracts the way other people watch television, obsessively, repeatedly, and finding problems nobody else sees. Everyone laughed except Jeffrey Lewis, Ryan's best friend since grade school, who stood by the fence staples and said nothing because he knew what they didn't. He knew about Kenneth. He knew about page 7. He knew this wasn't paranoia wearing a briefcase. This was preparation wearing the scars of watching your father lose everything he'd built. Amy heard the stories from the other farm wives, filtered through layers of judgment and social consequence. Linda Wilson had uninvited them from her anniversary party after Ryan questioned the department store's gift registry return policy. Barbara Thompson mentioned casually that people were calling Ryan difficult. Nancy Davis wondered aloud at church whether maybe Ryan needed to relax a little, trust people more, not assume everyone was out to get him. The farm wives talked at their weekly coffee gatherings, while Amy poured cream and smiled and said nothing, because what could she say? That her husband read contracts, because at 16 he'd watched his father cry over 3 words buried in Section 8. That paranoia was just preparation with a bad reputation, that she'd rather be married to someone people called difficult than someone people called bankrupt. People are talking, Ryan. She brought it up one evening after supper, standing at the sink while he dried dishes, the kitchen window open to let in the June air. About what? About you being difficult, suspicious, hard to work with. I'm not hard to work with. I'm hard to deceive. Linda Wilson uninvited us from their anniversary party. Why? Because you caused a scene at the department store about gift registry terms last month. Ryan set down the dish towel, his jaw tightening in that way it did when he was trying to stay patient. I didn't cause a scene. I asked questions about their return policy. To them, questions are scenes. Ryan, this is affecting us socially. Would you rather be popular or protected? Amy turned from the sink, soap suds dripping from her hands. Both ideally, but I understand why you do it. She did understand. That was the difference between Amy and the other wives. She'd seen Kenneth's contract. She knew what page 7 could do to a family. She'd chosen to marry Ryan, knowing full well that he'd read their marriage license for 18 minutes while the courthouse clerk tapped her pen impatiently. But understanding didn't make the social isolation easier. It just made it bearable. December 1976, the night Brandon was born, Ryan nearly missed it, arguing about a liability waiver. Amy's water broke at 2:15 a.m. contractions, already 3 minutes apart and intensifying fast. They made it to Hancock County Hospital by 2:42, and the nurse thrust admission forms at Ryan while orderlies wheeled Amy toward the delivery wing. "Sign these quickly. Your wife needs to get to delivery." Ryan started reading. Page 1 was identification and insurance, straightforward. Page 2 was treatment authorization, acceptable. Page 3 stopped him cold. Patient and family hereby waive and release hospital physician staff and affiliated medical personnel from any and all claims, damages, or legal actions arising from treatment care procedures or outcomes, including, but not limited to, claims of negligence, malpractice, or substandard care. "I'm not signing this." The nurse's professional courtesy evaporated. "Sir, it's standard admission. It's an unconscionable negligence waiver. You can't contract away medical malpractice liability in advance. It's void under Iowa law. Mr. Mitchell, your wife is about to deliver." From down the hall, Amy's voice cut through sharp with pain and fury. "Nicholas, sign the form. Not this clause. I'll sign everything except paragraph 3. The nurse called for the hospital administrator, who arrived 20 minutes later in sweatpants and a coat thrown over pajamas, looking like a man pulled from sleep, to deal with a problem nobody had prepared him for. "Mr. Mitchell, your wife is in active labor. This is not the time. This is exactly the time. You're using her pain as leverage to make me sign an illegal waiver." Ryan pulled out the pocket contract law reference Jonathan Bradford had given him years ago, the pages worn soft from use. "Iowa Code Section 147.138 prohibits pre-injury waivers of medical malpractice liability. Your clause is void and unenforceable, so why include it?" The administrator's exhaustion showed in his shoulders. "Mr. Mitchell, rewrite paragraph 3. Patient acknowledges inherent medical risks as explained by physician. Remove the negligence waiver, or we're leaving for Mason City Hospital." Amy's scream from the delivery room made the decision for them. The administrator rewrote the clause on hospital letterhead. Ryan read it in 8 minutes, signed, and Brandon Christopher Mitchell entered the world at 4:23 a.m., 7 pounds 6 ounces, healthy and furious about the fluorescent lights. For 3 days after Amy wouldn't speak to him, not angry words, just silence, the kind that weighs more than accusations. On the 4th day, she finally turned to him while Brandon nursed. "You almost missed our son's birth, arguing about a contract." "I didn't miss it. I negotiated a legal clause before signing." "What if something had gone wrong while you argued?" "Nothing went wrong, but it could have." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Ryan saw it. Then the fear she'd been carrying, the image of something happening while he stood in a hallway parsing liability language. The math of risk he'd been calculating against the wrong variables. "You've let your father's trauma control our entire life." The words hit like a physical thing. Ryan sat down on the edge of the hospital bed, and for the first time since Kenneth died, Amy saw her husband cry. I was 16. I watched Dad lose 120 acres because he signed page 9 without reading page 7. I watched him age 10 years in 2 months. I heard him cry at the kitchen table. The words came out broken, years of accumulated weight finally too heavy to carry alone. I can't unsee that. I can't unknow what I know, that contracts have traps, that fine print costs people everything they own. I'm not paranoid, I'm informed, and I can't turn it off. Amy set Brandon in the bassinet and pulled Ryan's head against her shoulder. I know, but not every piece of paper is trying to take our farm. How do I know which ones are? The only way I know is to read them, all of them. They sat like that for a long time, the hospital room quiet, except for Brandon's small sounds and the hum of machinery keeping track of things that mattered. Then here's the deal. Amy's voice had shifted practical now, problem solving. Financial documents, loans, land equipment, those are yours. Read every word, but social stuff, gift receipts, party, RSVPs, church forms, I handle those. You trust my judgment. You won't sign anything financially binding without me reading it. I won't. But you won't interrogate store clerks about gift return policies. Ryan managed something close to a smile. Deal. They shook hands like negotiators closing a contract, and Amy laughed despite herself. We just negotiated our marriage. Should I write it down? Don't push it. But while Ryan was building his reputation as the county's most difficult customer, his best friend, Jeffrey Lewis, was building something else, an empire of debt that looked like prosperity right up until it started to collapse. Jeffrey farmed the land adjacent to Ryan's 160 acres, 240 acres of good ground that his father had bought in the 1940s. Same age as Ryan, same schools, same little league teams, but opposite philosophy about risk and trust and the difference between the two. Life's too short to read every contract, Nick. You gotta trust people. Jeffrey signed his first major loan in 1969, financing for a new John Deere 402 tractor, $8,400 at 11% over 5 years. He spent 20 minutes in Timothy Harris's office, signed where the tabs indicated, shook hands, drove home with his new tractor. Did you read the whole contract? Ryan asked it casually, already knowing the answer from the timeline. Timothy's a good guy. Why would I need to? Because good intentions don't matter when ownership changes or policies shift. You worry too much. 3 years later, Jeffrey bought 160 acres from a retiring neighbor, doubling his operation to 400 acres. The loan was $64,000 at 10.5% variable. He was excited, expansive, convinced that leverage was the path to prosperity. Expanding. You should too. What's your acceleration clause say? Jeffrey looked at Ryan like he'd asked what color his barn was. I don't know. Standard bank stuff. Can I read it? Jeffrey showed him the contract. Ryan found it on page 5, buried in section 8. Bank may accelerate for any reason bank deems necessary. The exact language from Kenneth's 1955 contract. The exact 3 words that had cost them 120 acres. Ryan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Jeff, this is the clause that took my father's land. Banks don't just call good loans. You're paranoid. By 1975, Jeffrey had expanded again. Another 120 acres, total operation. Now 520 acres total debt. $156,000 at 12.5% variable. His annual debt service was manageable at $19,500 but only if nothing changed. Everything changed. Summer 1977. The warning signs were already visible to anyone who knew how to read them. Interest rates climbing, commodity prices softening, the careful balance between revenue and debt service starting to tilt. Jeffrey's rate had crept from 12.5 to 14.5%. His payment had jumped from $19,500 to $22,620. Ryan asked to see the loan documents. Why second-guessing your conservative approach? Worried about your aggressive one. Rates are climbing. Ryan read the contract slowly, the way he read everything, looking for the mechanisms that would determine Jeffrey's future. He found it in Section 4. This says your rate adjusts at bank's sole discretion based on cost of funds. It doesn't say rates go down, only up. The banker told me rates move both ways. What does the paper say? Jeffrey read the clause for the first time since signing it in 1972, 5 years of making payments without ever checking what he'd agreed to. It says, discretion, based on prevailing. It says up. David Taylor can raise this any time he wants, as high as he can justify, and your contract gives you no recourse. The friendship strained after that. Jeffrey tried to renegotiate his rate, asking David Taylor to lock it at the current 14.5. The bank refused, citing the contract's variable rate provision and the rising rate environment. Jeffrey came back to Ryan, angry, frustrated, looking for someone to blame. The bank won't budge. You were right about the clause. I'm sorry. Are you? Or are you happy to be right? I'm your friend. I don't want you to lose your farm. Then why didn't you make me read it in 1972? I tried. You said I was paranoid. The words hung between them, true and useless. Jeffrey stormed out, didn't speak to Ryan for 8 months, until their wives forced them to sit down at dinner and remember that friendship mattered more than being right or wrong about contract law. I'm sorry, I blamed you for my own choices. Jeffrey said it quietly. His anger burned down to something closer to resignation. I could have pushed harder. I wouldn't have listened. I thought you were crazy. Turns out you were just careful. What's your rate now? 17%. Payments $26,500 at 20 annually. Can you make that if corn stays above $2.50 and yields are good? It's tight. Ryan knew corn was already at $2.35 and falling, but he didn't say it. Some things you couldn't warn people about because the warning came too late to matter. While Jeffrey watched his debt service consume his operation, Timothy Harris faced his own reckoning with fine print he'd never read. Harris Equipment had been the county's John Deere dealer since 1968, when Timothy bought the franchise for $45,000 and built it into the top-performing dealership in North Iowa. By 1980, he'd sold 54 tractors, combines, and planters in a single year, revenue of $1.4 million, profit of $198,000. He bought a new house, a new truck, joined the country club, told the Rotary Club that farm equipment was recession-proof because farmers always needed bigger machines. The franchise agreement he'd signed in 1968 was 87 pages of legal language. Timothy had signed where the John Deere rep pointed page 4, page 19, page 53, page 87, and never looked at it again. Who reads 87 pages? 1981 brought the answer to his rhetorical question. People who want to know what they signed. Sales collapsed. 54 units in 1980, 26 in 1981, 11 in 1982. Revenue down 80% from peak, but franchise fees stayed the same. Inventory requirements stayed the same floor plan. Interest kept accruing on unsold equipment, gathering rust on his lot. December 1982. The letter arrived from John Deere Regional Office in Waterloo. Pursuant to Section 14.7 of your franchise agreement, John Deere Company hereby initiates formal review of your franchise due to sustained underperformance relative to regional operational benchmarks. Timothy called the regional manager out, panic making his voice tight. Thomas, you're 58% below quota. We need to discuss termination. There's a recession. Everyone's below quota. Not everyone. Your contract permits termination for underperformance. Page 52. Timothy pulled the franchise agreement from his filing cabinet for the first time in 14 years. Dust on the cover. He turned to page 52 and read the clause that had been sitting there waiting for him since 1968. Manufacturer reserves unilateral right to terminate franchise upon 60 days written notice for underperformance as measured against regional performance benchmarks determined quarterly by manufacturer. Underperformance, never defined. Regional benchmarks, never specified. He kept reading, found 6 more clauses he'd never known existed. Personal guarantee on all dealership debts. Manufacturer lien on all assets. Non-compete preventing him from selling competitor equipment within 100 miles for 5 years. Forced inventory buyback at 55% wholesale if terminated. Liquidated damages of $125,000 for early termination before the 30-year term. If John Deere pulled the trigger, Timothy's total exposure was around $500,000. His net worth was roughly $180,000. Bankruptcy wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable. He drove to Ryan's farm on a Saturday afternoon in January 1983, the visit costing him more pride than the 47-mile round trip cost in fuel. Ryan was in the barn repairing a hydraulic line on the farmall when Timothy's truck pulled up. "I need help." Ryan wiped his hands on a rag, already knowing what kind of help Timothy meant. "With what? Reading something I should have read in 1968. Your franchise agreement. How did you? Because you're here. You finally opened it." They spent 6 hours at Ryan's kitchen table, Amy bringing coffee and sandwiches, but staying out of the room, understanding, without being told, that this was the kind of conversation that required privacy and silence. Ryan read all 87 pages, making notes, highlighting clauses, cross-referencing sections, while Timothy sat across from him, looking like a man watching his own autopsy. "Define underperformance for me." "What does your quarterly benchmark letter say?" "I don't get quarterly benchmark letters." "You should. The contract says, benchmarks determined quarterly." If they're not sending you the benchmarks, how can you know if you're underperforming? I never thought about that. Ryan found the argument buried in the contract's own language. The manufacturer must notify the dealer of benchmarks. Failure to notify meant the dealer couldn't be held responsible for underperformance he had no way to measure. When did you last receive written benchmark notification? Never. Not in 14 years. They drafted an 8-page response arguing procedural failure, mathematical flaws in self-referential benchmarks, and recession as force majeure outside dealer control. John Deere granted a 6-month extension through August 1983. "You saved me 6 months, maybe a year." Timothy said it like a man who knew exactly how much time he had left. "You're not out of it yet." "I know, I wanted to say something." Timothy's hands were flat on the table, steady despite everything. "I made fun of you for 15 years. Called you paranoid, obsessive, told people you read contracts like other men read. Well, I said some crude things. I know. I signed my franchise agreement exactly how everyone signs them. Pages the rep pointed to, didn't read past page 5. Trusted John Deere." He looked up, meeting Ryan's eyes for the first time since arriving. Page 52 had the clause, "That's killing me," and I never knew it existed until they used it against me. Same clause, different document, same result. If I survive this, and I probably won't, and if I ever have kids, I'm teaching them what you taught yourself. Read everything. Trust nothing until you verify it. But Timothy's temporary reprieve was just that, temporary. 17 tractors still sat unsold on his lot, worth $430,000 new, but maybe $280 at current market floor plan interest of $3,400 monthly, eating through his capital like acid. By summer 1983, the bankruptcy filing was already inevitable. Just a matter of when, not if. While individual farmers and dealers discovered too late what their contracts actually said, the broader economy was assembling the pieces of a catastrophe that would test every clause, every provision, every 3-word phrase buried in Section 8. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve raised interest rates to historic levels, the prime climbing from 11.2% in January 1979 to 21.5% in June 1981, the highest in American history. Farm credit followed the same trajectory, upward variable rates hitting 18 to 22%. Fixed-rate loans became unavailable at any price. Commodity prices moved in the opposite direction. Corn dropped from $3.11 a bushel in 1980 to $2.42 in 1982 to $1.88 by early 1983. Soybeans fell from $7.57 to $5.23. Wheat from $4.35 to $3.12. Revenue down 40%. Costs up 20%. Net farm income for the average Iowa operation, negative $22,000 in 1982. Lancaster County absorbed the impact like a body absorbing bullets. 178 active farm operations in 1980. By early 1983, 47 were in severe distress, loan-to-value ratios above 80%, or payment defaults, or both. Main Street, Riverside lost 10 of 34 businesses. The school district's enrollment dropped 20%. Population declined 15% as families packed up and left for jobs in Des Moines or Chicago or anywhere that wasn't a dying farm town. The banking crisis followed inevitably. Lancaster County Savings Bank's portfolio told the story in numbers that meant catastrophe. Total loans, $8.7 million. Farm loans, $5.9 million, 68% of their book. Farm loans underwater, $3.6 million. Problem loans, more than 30 days past due, $2.1 million. Bank capital, $910,000. Risk exposure ratio, 3.96 to 1, when federal examiners wanted 1.5 or better. November 1982, the FDIC sent examiners for a special review. Joseph Davis Regional Office spent 2 weeks going through the books and emerged with a verdict that sounded like a death sentence. Portfolio severely impaired. Capital inadequate. Risk exposure unacceptable. Reduce exposure by 1.8 million within 90 days, or face enforcement action potentially including receivership. December 14th, the board met in emergency session. David Taylor, bank president, laid out their options with the dispassion of a surgeon explaining an amputation. Raise capital couldn't know investors wanted a failing rural bank. Sell loans couldn't know buyers in a collapsing market. Call loans could and had to. The vote was 5-0 because there was no other choice. Call any loan where loan-to-value exceeded 70% or where payment had been missed in the fourth quarter of 1982. 13 loans qualified. David reviewed the files alone after the meeting, confirming what he already knew. All 13 had the standard acceleration clause. For any reason. The exact language that had destroyed Kenneth Mitchell in 1957 now replicated across 13 more families 26 years later because nobody had learned the lesson Ryan had learned at 16. He checked one more file, knowing it wouldn't be there, but needing to verify anyway. Ryan Mitchell. Operating line of credit paid off in 1980. Annual renewals since then, more formality than necessity. The modified clause from 1965 was still in place, highlighted and noted and protected by 18 years of careful attention. Thank God. At least I won't have to argue with Mitchell about contract clauses while the bank's collapsing. He assigned Andrew Jackson to make the calls. 13 names typed alphabetically, each one a family that would lose everything because of words they'd never read. February 8th. Get it done in one day. Andrew took the list, recognizing names he'd known his whole life. Jeffrey Lewis was number 7. Customers of Timothy Harris scattered through the rest. Good people, most of them. Some who'd never missed a payment, all of them trapped by the same clause. These are good people. Some never missed a payment. I know, but the contract allows it. For any reason. This is the reason. The night before making the calls, David gave Andrew one final instruction that seemed strange until you understood what David was really testing. After you call the 13, make one more call. Who? Ryan Mitchell. But he's not on the list. His loan's paid off. I know. Call him anyway. Tell him we're calling his operating loan. Why? Because I want to see if he really knows his contract as well as legend says, or if he's been bluffing for 18 years. Andrew suspected the truth was something else that David needed to know if preparation could actually protect you, if reading the fine print made a difference, if the lesson Kenneth Mitchell had died teaching his son was worth learning. But he didn't say that. He just nodded and took the list home, knowing that tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. he'd start making phone calls that would destroy 13 families. What nobody at the bank knew, what nobody in Lancaster County understood, despite 18 years of watching Ryan Mitchell read every document that crossed his desk, was that he'd been preparing for this exact moment since 12:09 a.m. on a July night in 1957. Since the moment he'd written in his notebook, "I will read every contract I ever sign." Every year, when Ryan renewed his operating line, he pulled out the original 1965 contract and compared it to the renewal terms. Every year, he checked that the modified acceleration clause was still there, still restricting the bank's power to the two triggers he'd negotiated: payment default or intentional damage. Nothing else. Not market conditions, not portfolio management, not any reason. Every year he highlighted it again in yellow, the old marks fading, but new ones added layer upon layer of preparation for a disaster everyone said would never come. Until Tuesday morning, February 8th, 1983, when the phone rang and Andrew Jackson's voice came through asking Ryan to read him the acceleration clause from his contract. The legend was about to be tested. 18 years of preparation against 3 words that had destroyed his father. Page 6, Section 4, Paragraph 2. Ryan had it memorized, had it highlighted, had it protected by a promise he'd made to himself before he was old enough to understand what that promise would cost in social capital and friendships and normal human trust. But he understood now, sitting in his kitchen with the phone to his ear and his copy of the contract open on the table, exactly what it was worth. Everything. Friday morning, February 11th, 1983, 10 a.m. The conference room at Lancaster County Savings Bank smelled like old coffee and the kind of tension that comes from people knowing they're about to have a conversation nobody wants. David Taylor sat at the head of the oak table, 55 years old, and looking every day of it after 3 nights of minimal sleep. To his right, Andrew Jackson, with files stacked in careful order. To his left, Mark Thompson, called back from retirement because David wanted the man who'd written Ryan's original loan in the room when this went down. At the far end, Richard Brown, the bank's attorney, brought in for legal protection against whatever was about to happen. The window overlooked Main Street, where snow had started falling again, fat flakes drifting past the closed hardware store and the empty diner and all the other spaces where businesses used to be. Ryan walked in at 9:58, carrying a manila folder worn soft at the edges from 18 years of handling. Clean boots, pressed jeans, a flannel shirt Amy had ironed that morning. He looked like what he was, a farmer who'd come to town for business and expected to be taken seriously. He set the folder on the table, aligned it precisely with the edge, and remained standing until David gestured to a chair. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I understand there's some disagreement about Ryan cut through the preamble with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in his head for 26 years. There's no disagreement, Mr. Taylor. You called my loan. I'm here to show you why you can't." He opened the folder and removed the original 1965 contract, the pages slightly yellowed but intact, the clause on page 6 highlighted in layers of faded yellow marker like sedimentary rock, showing the passage of time. "This is my acceleration clause, negotiated with Mr. Thompson in May 1965, approved by Harold Martin, your predecessor." He turned the contract so everyone could see his finger pointing to the highlighted section. Lender may demand full payment of outstanding balance only upon written notice of a borrower default on scheduled payment exceeding 30 days from due date, or B, borrower's intentional physical damage to pledged collateral as verified by lender inspection. The word "only" was circled in red ink, the circle so dark it had nearly bled through the paper. 2 triggers: payment default or intentional damage. Nothing else. Not market conditions, not board policy, not portfolio management, not any reason. He pulled payment records from the folder, spreading them across the table like evidence at a trial. Every canceled check, every receipt, every confirmation letter for 18 years. I have never defaulted, not once, not in 18 years. Every payment on time or early. Richard Brown, the attorney, leaned forward to examine the highlighted clause, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to professional concern. Mr. Mitchell's payments are current. Andrew's voice came out quieter than he'd intended. Actually, his loan's been paid off since 1980. There's no outstanding balance. David nodded slowly, the movement tired. I know, but I wanted to see if Mr. Mitchell knew his contract as well as everyone says. Apparently he does. The room settled into a silence broken only by the sound of Richard Brown flipping through the renewal documents Ryan had laid out. Each one showed the same clause carried forward year after year, protected by annual verification and careful attention to detail. Mr. Thompson. David turned to Mark, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Did you approve this modification to the standard clause in 1965? Mark's hands rested flat on the table, the fingers of a man who'd spent 40 years handling documents and who now had to explain why he'd changed one that mattered. Yes, Mr. Mitchell requested the change as a condition of accepting the loan. I took it to Harold Martin and he approved it. The borrower was low-risk, good collateral, and we wanted the business. And the modification was never reversed in any subsequent renewal, Ryan answered before Mark could. Every renewal carries the same terms as the original agreement, unless both parties agree to changes. I never agreed to changes. He fanned the renewal documents across the table, each one tabbed with colored stickers, each one showing the modified clause in the same position, same language, same protection. Here are the 18 renewals. Each one carries forward the restricted acceleration clause. Each one signed by both parties, each one legally binding. Richard Brown set down the documents and looked at David with the expression lawyers use when delivering bad news to clients who aren't going to like it. The contract is clear, David. The acceleration trigger is limited to default or intentional damage. There's no default. There's no damage. We have no legal basis to call this loan, and even if we did, there's no loan to call. It's paid off. David leaned back in his chair, studying Ryan across the table. Mr. Mitchell, you negotiated this clause when you were 24 years old. 24, yes, sir. You've maintained these records for 18 years. Every document, every letter, every receipt. Organized, tabbed, annotated. The question hung unasked between them, why? Because in 1957, my father lost 120 acres to the First National Bank of Fairfield. Ryan's voice stayed level factual, as if he were discussing crop yields instead of generational trauma. He'd never missed a payment. The bank called his loan under an acceleration clause that said, "For any reason." My father didn't know the clause existed because he never read the contract. He trusted the banker. The banker was his friend, Kenneth Allen. The name came from Mark Thompson, who'd been in banking long enough to have heard all the cautionary tales from neighboring counties. Gary Mitchell, my father. Ryan corrected the name, but his tone didn't change. He lost the land to a clause he didn't know was there, sold 120 acres at 60 cents on the dollar to cover an $8,000 loan he'd never defaulted on. 3 words on page 7, for any reason. The room had gone very quiet. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, four men who worked in banking were hearing the story they'd all heard variations of the nightmare scenario that justified every conservative lending practice and risk assessment model, except this time it was sitting across the table from them with 18 years of documentation proving that knowledge was the only defense. I was 16 years old. I sat in our kitchen and listened to my father tell my mother what happened. Then I read his contract, every page, every section, every word. Ryan's hands remained still on the table. No nervous movement, just the calm of someone stating facts that had shaped everything he'd become. I decided that night I would never sign something I didn't understand, and I would never give a bank the right to take my land for any reason other than my own failure. David looked at the 13 files stacked on his desk, visible through the conference room's glass wall. 13 farmers whose loans were being called that week. 13 families about to lose everything because of the same 3 words Ryan had eliminated from his contract 18 years ago. Those other 13 farmers on Andrew's list, how many of them read their contracts Ryan didn't answer because they both knew. The silence was answer enough. My father didn't read his. It cost him 120 acres, his health, his pride, and the last 6 years of his life. He died at 63, looking like he was 80. He gathered his documents, placing them back in the manila folder with the same careful precision he'd used to organize them. I hope those 13 men have families who can help them through what's coming, because what's coming is what came for my father in 1957. Same clause, same words, same result. 26 years later, and nobody's learned a thing. Ryan tucked the folder under his arm, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Mr. Taylor, you called my loan to test if I knew my contract." "I did. But you should know something else. I know theirs too. I know exactly what's about to happen to those 13 families, because I watched it happen to mine." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. For 30 seconds, nobody in the conference room moved. He was right about everything. Richard Brown broke the silence, stacking the documents he'd reviewed into a neat pile. Every point of law, every contractual provision, every detail. He knew his contract better than we do. Mark Thompson sat back, looking at his hands. I remember thinking he was paranoid in 1965, spending almost 5 hours on a $6,000 loan, making us rewrite clauses that had been in our standard contract for 20 years. I thought he was damaged from what happened to his father. He was. David's voice was quiet, but he turned that damage into preparation, and preparation into protection. While Ryan Mitchell walked out of that conference room with his land intact, the 13 other farmers on Andrew's list faced the mathematics of catastrophe. Jeffrey Lewis lost his farm in August 1983. The auction notice went up at the county courthouse in July, and by the time the auctioneer's voice cut through the humid air on that Tuesday morning, everyone in Lancaster County knew the story. 520 acres, equipment, livestock, everything that made a farm instead of just land with buildings on it. The bidding was brutal in its efficiency. Corporate buyers from Des Moines and Chicago who saw distressed assets instead of families. Local farmers who couldn't meet Jeffrey's eyes while they bid, but needed the ground to survive, investors who calculated ROI while Jeffrey stood to the side watching his life get sold at wholesale. Land went for $198,000 that had cost $420,000 to assemble through the 1970s. Equipment brought $67,000 that had been worth $180,000 new. When the math settled, Jeffrey walked away, owing $35,000 after paying the bank, the lawyers, the auctioneers, everyone who takes their cut when desperation forces a sale. He found Ryan at the grain elevator 2 weeks later, both of them waiting for trucks to load. Michelle and I are moving to Omaha. Her sister has a place. I got work in construction. Jeffrey's voice had the flat quality of someone who'd run out of emotions to feel. I'm sorry, Jeff. Don't be. You tried to warn me. 77. You read my contract and told me the clause was dangerous. I called you paranoid. The loader beeped in reverse, backing toward Jeffrey's truck. Turns out paranoid means prepared, and prepared means survival. Ryan didn't say anything. Sometimes there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like winning an argument nobody should have had to have. Teach your kids what you taught yourself. Read everything. Trust nothing until you verify it. Jeffrey climbed into his truck and drove away, and Ryan never saw him again. Heard later he was doing fine in Omaha that Michelle was teaching, and the kids were adjusting that construction paid better than farming had at the end. But fine wasn't the same as whole, and everyone knew it. Timothy Harris filed bankruptcy in March 1985, 2 years of trying to outrun mathematics that had him cornered from the moment John Deere sent that first letter. The dealership closed on a Tuesday, the big glass windows papered over with foreclosure notices, 17 tractors still sitting on the lot, like monuments to the difference between industry standard and actually reading what standard meant. He stopped by Ryan's farm before leaving for Des Moines, his wife already gone. The marriage, another casualty of stress that exceeded what two people could carry together. I owe you an apology. 15 years of making fun of you. Ryan was in the barn, predictably doing maintenance on equipment that would outlast him because he took care of things. I know. I called you the most difficult customer in 3 counties. Said you read contracts like other men read. Well, I said some crude things. You did. Timothy managed something that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. I signed my franchise agreement the same way everyone does, where the rep pointed, didn't read past page 5, trusted John Deere. He looked at the barn floor, at the oil stains and scattered tools and all the evidence of a working farm that would keep working because its owner had made different choices. Page 52 had the clause that killed me, and I never knew it existed until they used it against me. Same clause, different document. Ryan set down the wrench he'd been holding, giving Timothy his full attention. Same result. If I ever have kids, Timothy's voice caught on the conditional, on the future that looked nothing like what he'd planned. I'm teaching them what you taught yourself. Read everything. Trust nothing until you verify it. That's not paranoia. That's literacy. What's the difference? Paranoia is irrational fear. Literacy is rational preparation. One keeps you up at night. The other helps you sleep. Timothy left, and Ryan went back to his maintenance, the Farmall 5, 6. Oh, engine spread across the workbench. in components that he'd reassemble correctly because he'd taken them apart carefully, because attention to detail was the difference between things working and things breaking, same as contracts. 9 of the 13 farmers lost everything. Sales scattered through 1983 and 1984, each auction another variation on the same theme of families standing aside while strangers bid on their lives. 4 managed to negotiate workouts that saved their operations but cost them equity penalty fees, higher rates, additional assets, pledged against the possibility of surviving long enough to matter. Lancaster County absorbed the losses the way a body absorbs injuries, each one leaving scar tissue that changed how things worked afterward. School enrollment dropped to 567 from 712 in 1980. Population fell below 2,500. Main Street had more empty storefronts than open businesses. The Friday night football games still happened, but the crowds were smaller, quieter, made up of people who stayed because leaving meant admitting defeat. Through it all, Ryan kept farming his 160 acres with the same careful attention he'd applied to contracts. Same debt-free operation, same conservative management, same fixed costs and minimal leverage. By 1986, he had $67,000 in savings accumulated through 23 years of putting money away after every harvest while his neighbors borrowed and expanded and signed documents they didn't read. April 12, 1986. The auction that completed the circle. James Hill's 120 acres came up for sale. The neighboring farmer who'd bought Kenneth's land in 1957, now retiring without heirs, selling everything to fund a move to Arizona where his daughter lived. The legal description in the auction notice made Ryan's chest tighten when he read it. Section 18, Township 96, North Range 24 West, the exact same land. Kenneth's 120 acres lost at 60 cents on the dollar because of 3 words on page 7, now available again at whatever price desperation or opportunity would bring. The auction happened on the courthouse steps in Riverside, 58 degrees, and sunny spring finally arriving after a winter that had felt like it would never end. 40 people gathered on the sidewalk, a mix of farmers and investors, and the curious who came to auctions the way some people went to car crashes. Ryan stood near the back, dressed the same way he'd dressed for the bank meeting, clean boots, pressed jeans, flannel shirt. Amy was beside him, one hand resting light on his arm in the way couples develop after years of knowing when touch means support. James Hill himself ran the auction, his voice carrying the rhythmic chant that auctioneers use to make selling sound like inevitability. 120 acres, good soil. Lancaster County. Section 18, productive ground, creek access, excellent drainage. Let's start at $250 per acre. The corporate buyer from Des Moines opened at $280. Robert Moore, a local farmer who'd survived the crisis by selling 40% of his operation, went to $290. Ryan raised his hand for $300. The bidding climbed through the hundreds, $320, $330, $350, until Moore dropped out. And it was just Ryan and the corporate buyer, a man in a suit who represented investors who'd never seen the land they were buying, who calculated returns on spreadsheets and didn't know what it meant to lose ground your father had worked. $360. The corporate buyer's voice was bored, transactional. $380. Ryan's response was immediate. The buyer hesitated, consulting with his partner, who had a calculator and a thick folder of comparable sales. The math was simple. At $380 per acre, they'd be paying above recent market. The buyer shook his head, and the partner nodded. $385. Ryan could feel Amy's hand tighten on his arm, the pressure asking a question he'd already answered in his head. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. $400, cash? The buyer turned to look at him fully for the first time. You're overpaying, Mr. Mitchell. Land's worth $350 tops in this market. Maybe, but I know this land. I know what it's worth to me. The buyer conferred with his partner again, longer this time, but the math hadn't changed. At $400, the numbers stopped working. He shook his head and stepped back. Sold to Ryan Mitchell for $400 per acre. $48,000 total. The crowd applauded in the way people do at auctions when local wins over corporate, not knowing the story behind the purchase, not understanding that this was anything more than one farmer buying another farmer's ground. James Hill approached Ryan afterward, recognition dawning in his face as he did the arithmetic of memory. Wait. This is the land I bought from your father, 57, Kenneth Mitchell. I know, Mr. Hill. You paid $108 an acre. I just paid $400. You paid more than it's worth. No, sir, I paid exactly what it's worth to me. The closing happened at David Taylor's office 3 days later, the same office where Ryan had sat in February and explained why the bank couldn't call his loan. David watched him write the check, $48,000 drawn on Lancaster County Savings Bank, paying for land with money saved from farming carefully while everyone else leveraged their futures. You bought the Lewis acreage. David's voice carried a question he wasn't quite asking. No, sir. I bought the Mitchell acreage, my father's land, lost in 1957, returning in 1986. This was Kenneth's 120 acres. David pulled the deed from the file, checking the legal description against property records that went back decades. Same land. First National Bank called his loan, took his land. He sold to Hill for $108 an acre. Total $12,960. Ryan signed the deed with the same careful attention he gave to every document. I just bought it back for $48,000. 29 years. I've been waiting 29 years without knowing I was waiting. That evening, Amy cried when he told her. Not sad crying, the complicated kind that comes from understanding what something means beyond its surface. You bought your father's land back. I did. He'd be proud, maybe. Or maybe he'd say I overpaid by $40 an acre and wasted $4,800. They both laughed, because it was exactly what Kenneth would have said, the kind of practical observation that farmers make about money and land and the intersection of the two. But later, after Amy had gone to bed, Ryan walked out to the barn where the Farmall 560 sat in the same spot it had occupied since 1963. He put his hand on the hood, the metal cold under his palm, and stood there for 10 minutes, not moving, not talking, just standing on land that was his again, because he'd read page 6 when he was 24 and refused to sign what everyone else signed. The reconciliation with Timothy came in 1988, 5 years after the crisis, long enough for wounds to scar over, if not quite heal. Timothy drove back to Lancaster County, visiting family, and stopped at the feed store out of habit, muscle memory, pulling him to a place he'd spent 20 years conducting business. Ryan was there, buying fence supplies, the kind of routine errand that makes up farming between the dramatic moments everyone remembers. They stood by the loading dock while employees moved bags of mineral supplement and rolls of wire, two men who'd spent years on opposite sides of an argument about whether reading contracts made you careful or crazy. I heard about the loan, 1983. Bank tried to call it. Timothy's voice had lost some of its certainty, the way voices do when experience teaches lessons that ego had previously blocked. They tried. The contract said they couldn't. I said some things about you over the years, the fine print stuff, the dictionary at the bank. Called you paranoid, difficult, obsessive. I know. I signed my franchise agreement the same way everyone else did, where the tabs were. Didn't read. Timothy looked at the parking lot where his dealership used to have 4 trucks with his name on the side before John Deere and page 52, and the difference between industry standard and actually knowing what you agreed to. My agreement had the termination clause on page 52. I didn't discover that until they used it against me. Same clause, different document. Same result. I'm sorry you didn't read yours. Ryan meant it, the sincerity evident in how he said it. Not triumph, not vindication, just genuine regret that knowledge had cost Timothy everything, while ignorance had cost him the same. If I ever have kids, I'm teaching them what you taught yourself. Read everything. That's not paranoia. That's literacy. What's the difference? Ryan set down the receipt he'd been examining, giving Timothy the full answer the question deserved. Paranoia is irrational fear of things that won't happen. Literacy is rational preparation for things that might. One makes you anxious. The other makes you ready. They shook hands like people settling a debt neither one could pay. And Timothy drove back to Des Moines while Ryan loaded his fence supplies and went home to a farm that stayed whole because he'd spent 18 years preparing for a disaster everyone said would never come. The years after 1986 passed in the rhythm of farming, planting, growing, harvesting, winter maintenance repeat. Ryan worked the 280 acres he'd assembled, the exact acreage Kenneth had owned before 1957. The circle completed through patience and preparation, and the accumulated savings from making different choices than everyone around him. Scott Mitchell grew up watching his father read contracts the way other kids' fathers watched football. By the time he was 12, it seemed normal. By the time he was 16, he understood why. "Dad, why do you spend so long on paperwork?" Scott asked it one evening in 1992, watching Ryan examine a grain delivery contract with the same intensity most people reserved for wedding vows. "Because your grandfather didn't, and it cost him everything." Ryan showed Scott the original 1957 contract, yellowed and fragile, now kept in a clear plastic sleeve in the filing cabinet that held 40 years of documents. He pointed to page 7, to the 3 words that had destroyed Kenneth's life. 3 words. That's all it took. Scott read the clause young enough that the legal language still looked like a foreign alphabet, old enough to understand that some lessons get taught in blood. You're learning it now without losing anything. That's 3 generations of wisdom. Don't waste it. I won't, Dad. And he didn't. When Scott went to Iowa State, and his roommate noticed that Scott's father had actually read their apartment lease, word by word, before co-signing, the roommate thought it was strange until Scott explained. My grandfather lost 120 acres because he didn't read page 7. My father got them back because he read page 6. I'm not about to be the generation that loses them again. The filing cabinet stayed in Ryan's office, 4 drawers of contracts organized by date and subject, every document highlighted and annotated and protected by the kind of attention most people reserve for things they love. The original 1965 loan sat in the front of the top drawer, the modified acceleration clause, visible through the plastic sleeve, a note paper clipped to the front in Ryan's handwriting. Page 6, Section 4. Read it. The Farmall 560 stayed in the barn, maintained, and started every spring, even though Scott used modern equipment for actual farming. GPS precision agriculture, yield monitors that Kenneth couldn't have imagined, and Ryan had adapted to cautiously. But the Farmall remained the tractor that had survived 1957 because Kenneth bought it with cash before taking the loan, the last piece of equipment from the original farm, still running after 46 years. Some things, if you take care of them, outlast everything the banks can do. Ryan said it to Scott one afternoon in 2004, both of them standing in the barn while the Farmall idled smoothly. The engine Ryan had rebuilt twice, now purring like it had 30 years left in it. "You're handing me the farm." Scott wasn't asking. He knew the timeline. Ryan was 63, the same age Kenneth had been when he died, and the symmetry felt meaningful enough to act on. Same acreage Dad had before 1957. 280 acres debt-free. Equipment paid off. $95,000 in operating capital. It's yours September 1st. They stood there, listening to the tractor, 2 generations of farmers who understood that land was both property and responsibility, something you held in trust for whoever came next. Was it worth it? All those hours reading contracts? Ryan was quiet for a moment, thinking about 40 years of being called difficult and paranoid, and obsessive about friendships, strained and social invitations withdrawn, and all the costs of choosing knowledge over trust. Let me tell you a story. February 1983. Tuesday morning. Bank called 13 farmers, 13 loans accelerated. Same clause in every contract. For any reason, I know this story. Do you know the ending? 9 of those 13 lost everything. Farms sold, families destroyed, lives shattered. Same bank, same crisis, same Tuesday morning phone call. But not you, not me. Why? Because you read the contract. Ryan put his hand on the Farmall's hood, the metal warm from the running engine. I read page 6. They didn't. That was the only difference. He pulled Scott toward the filing cabinet in the office, opened the top drawer, removed the plastic sleeve containing the 1965 contract. This filing cabinet, 40 years of contracts. It's yours now, but I want you to understand what it represents. Scott held the original loan, seeing his father's signature at 24 years old, seeing the highlighted clause that had protected their family when everyone else's fell apart. It's not paranoia. It's not obsession. It's the accumulated wisdom of a 16-year-old boy who watched his father lose 120 acres because of 3 words on page 7. Scott looked at the date. July 31st, 1957, 12:09 a.m., written in Ryan's teenage handwriting at the top of the notebook page, paperclipped to the contract. The contract doesn't care if you read it. The contract does what the contract says, whether you understand it or not, whether you agreed knowingly or not. Ryan's voice carried the weight of 47 years thinking about this, about the difference between trust and verification, about how many families would still be farming if they'd spent 5 hours reading instead of 30 minutes signing. The law doesn't protect the trusting. It protects the literate. Now here's something nobody in that bank understood, nobody in Lancaster County appreciated, despite watching Ryan Mitchell read documents for 18 years. This wasn't about being smarter or more careful or more suspicious than everyone else. This was about a 16-year-old boy sitting in a kitchen at midnight, reading his father's contract after the damage was already done, and making a promise to himself that changed everything that came after. That promise cost Ryan friendships and social capital and the comfort of trust. It earned him a reputation for difficulty that followed him through 4 decades of farming, but it also earned him 280 acres of debt-free land, while 9 of his neighbors lost everything to the same 3 words his father had signed without reading. So, let me ask you something, and take your time with this because the answer matters more than you think. Have you read your contracts? Not skimmed them, not trusted the person who said, "Everyone signs this." Actually read them, every clause, every provision, every 3-word phrase that could cost you everything you own. Because 13 farmers signed without reading. 1 farmer read every word. When the crisis came, only 1 was smiling. The contract doesn't care if you read it. The contract does what the contract says. And what the contract says is, whatever you agreed to when you signed it, whether you understood it or not, whether you meant to or not, whether you trusted the person who told you it was fine or not. Ryan Mitchell understood that, learned it watching his father break, remembered it for 47 years, protected himself with it when the bank came calling with the same clause that had destroyed Kenneth. And when he handed the farm to Scott in September 2004, he handed over the filing cabinet too. 4 drawers of contracts everyone read, everyone understood, everyone negotiated when the terms were unfair. 40 years of accumulated literacy in a world that preferred trust. The last thing Ryan told Scott before stepping back from daily operations was the same thing Kenneth had told him on that July morning in 1957. Don't trust what a man tells you the paper says. Read the paper yourself, every word. Scott promised he would, and unlike the 13 farmers who'd trusted Andrew Jackson when he said the acceleration was legal, unlike Jeffrey Lewis, who'd trusted that variable rates went both ways, unlike Timothy Harris, who'd trusted that industry standard meant fair, Scott kept his promise, because some lessons are worth learning even if they cost you 40 years of being called paranoid, especially then. The contract doesn't care if you read it, but the people who read it get to keep their land. Have you ever caught something buried in fine print that saved you or missed something that cost you? Because Ryan Mitchell's story isn't unique. It's just uncommon. And maybe it shouldn't be.